Well, the butting of heads between the Trump administration and American academic institutions continues to escalate. Well, for more on this, and indeed for more on what Europe could stand to gain and lose by it all, I'm joined now by Solange Mougin in the studio. Hi, Solange. So Donald Trump has been calling Harvard University a joke.
Yeah, he did indeed, despite the fact that Harvard is the U.S.'s oldest and richest institution of higher learning. It was founded in 1636, even before the United States existed, and it has an endowment of over $53 billion. And it is currently, along with a number of other American schools, in an ideological and funding battle with the Trump administration. So I'm going to break down the latest in the Harvard versus the White House fight, the pushback, and also who and what is really behind this. And then we'll get into how European universities and research institutions are trying to quickly position themselves in response to this crisis so that they can potentially become a welcoming place for fleeing academia. And yet, at the same time, there are also major financial roadblocks to this, especially for France. But first, the current epicenter of this, Harvard University, and nearly all of the other Ivy League schools and many other universities as well. The U.S. government has been making demands to multiple schools to essentially have more oversight over how these private institutions, some of them are public as well, how they are run and the kinds of programs they offer, dictating the race and the background of the students and also the faculty that they admit and hire. Now, the Trump administration has been doing this under the guise of trying to combat anti-Semitism on campuses in the aftermath of pro-Palestinian protests, but it is largely seen as not at all about that, or not mostly about that. For these institutions, it is an ideological crusade against academic freedom and their independence. France 24 spoke to a Harvard professor who expressed her views of the government's demands earlier this week.
It's really just a hurricane of attacks in the sort of agenda of a Viktor Orban. It's very authoritarian. So in that context, and in the context of Project 2025, which I encourage all of your viewers to look at, the main thing, one of the very first priorities, is to just obliterate education, which they've begun to do K through 12, and they're now attacking universities.
Now, Donald Trump has signed an order to dismantle the Department of Education, or the body that oversees grants. Also, conservative activists like Christopher Rufo are said to have been instrumental in trying to make these institutions feel, in Rufo's words, existential terror. And that is exactly what's happened, with conservatives going after essentially the money, be it federal funding or even potentially, as was just threatened by Donald Trump, the admission of foreign students to Harvard.
And how much federal funding are we actually talking about? What are the sums here?
Well, Harvard receives $9 billion in federal contracts and grants. Last month, the U.S. government said it was reviewing all of that. And then this week, it said that it was freezing $2.3 billion. Now, Harvard is, as I said earlier, the U.S.'s richest university, with over $53 billion in its endowment, which begs the question, can't Harvard afford this? Well, it can, but only to a certain degree and for a short amount of time. But it will hurt Harvard. Some projects have already been halted. People could be laid off, and medical research labs could be shut. And such cuts would have to be short-lived for it not to hurt Harvard financially in the long term. For example, Harvard could look to other sources for financing, such as private donors, but who has $9 billion to invest in long-term projects and research? And these are questions that many universities are now facing in what is a very sudden threat to what was, prior to Donald Trump's moves, standard practice for decades in the U.S., or federal funding that didn't come with major ideological oversight and such constricting strings attached to the federal money. Since World War II, the U.S. government has financed higher education and research for essentially the global good, or backing advances in science, in ideas, in democracy. That was blown apart to a certain degree, many are saying, by this rule change by Donald Donald Trump. Columbia, which was the first to come under fire here, capitulated to many of the demands last month, but its funding was then not suddenly unfrozen. Harvard took that as a cautionary tale, many are saying. Their refusal to, quote, and these are the president's words, negotiate over its independence or its constitutional rights has also actually bolstered other institutions, including Columbia University, which is actually holding a day of action protest against the government today to try and stop the government from trying to control schools' curriculum and their governments. In any case, Harvard students say that they are quite proud of the school for standing up for, they say, academic independence, but many are also quite worried.
I fully support it. I think it's important as a community here to, gather and face this all together.
I think it was really admirable. I mean, we've seen the way that other schools have been responding to it. And
I definitely hope that Harvard is going to use some of its endowment to, support continued financial aid for students, some of the critical research in, cancer research, medical research, and innovation that is happening at this place. But it is definitely gonna be felt all over campus.
And all this turmoil is having a kind of a global effect, isn't it?
It undoubtedly is and will in the coming weeks and months. But the degree to which the United States and U.S. education will be shaken is still unknown. And American academics and students, well, they are scared. The review Nature polled some of them, and it found that over 75% said that they are considering leaving the United States. So naturally, with the cracks showing in what was once the holy grail of learning or U.S. universities, other nations are positioning themselves already as potential alternatives. China actually stands to gain greatly here. Already the number of reviews that it publishes and the collaborations with other universities has been increasing in recent years. As for here in Europe, there are also calls to welcome fleeing American academics and researchers. Just this week in the newspaper Libération, the former French president François Hollande co-wrote an opinion piece saying that a refugee status for scientists and academics needs to be created. He said in this op-ed that this is a historic time to step up, and he also pointed out programs that have already popped up, like the ones in the Aix-Marseille University, which launched a, quote, safe place for science program to which some 300 candidates applied, and some American researchers, well, they're expected to start there in June. However, other views are coming out that put a bit of a damper on this. In another opinion piece, this one in Le Monde, Theo Besson, who's an academic, he writes that while the idea is great, it is a bit unrealistic, he says. He says that France's research budget was actually cut by $1 billion this year. Salaries are much lower here, especially in academia. Also, France is the only nation in the EU, according to UNESCO, where scientific productivity shrank between 2015 and 2019. Finally, the article points to the fact that the U.S. spends 3.46% of its GDP on research and on development, while France allocates just over 2%. And of course, economically, it is a much smaller country. Germany, Belgium, and Sweden, and also Switzerland, he writes, may be better positioned when it comes to salaries and government funding of projects. But even the funding of those nations pales in comparison to the American funds. So we'll have to see if the EU steps up and to what degree. Nonetheless, this is a bit of an earthquake for the academic world and globally. So the silver lining here potentially is that it's creating outrage and pushback at these universities.
Well, very interesting. Thanks very much, Solange Mougin, there with that story and its repercussions around the world and here in Europe as well.